Maria adjusted the crisp, white apron around her waist, her fingers fumbling slightly as she glanced at her reflection in the small mirror tucked away in the staff lounge. She didn't belong here, not in this glittering, glass-walled paradise of privilege, but here she was. She took a deep breath and reminded herself why she'd taken the job. The pay was good, and she needed to rebuild her life. The elegant halls and manicured grounds of the Greenridge Golf Club were worlds away from her modest upbringing, but necessity didn't leave room for preferences. As she stepped into the bright lobby, the polished marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the faint hum of chatter from well-dressed members filled the air. Maria smiled politely at the front desk clerk, who barely looked up from her computer, and made her way toward the utility closet. She hadn't been on the job more than an hour, and already she felt the weight of the club's unspoken rules. Blend in, stay invisible, and above all, don't disrupt the members' perfect world. Her first task was to tidy the equipment lockers. Maria worked diligently, her movements efficient and careful, but her curiosity was piqued as she passed rows of meticulously organized golf clubs. Some were sleek and modern, others gleamed with custom designs. She paused in front of one particularly striking set, its golden finish catching the light just right. Admiring the craftsmanship, are we? A voice cut through the quiet. Maria turned, startled, to find a man standing behind her. His sharp suit and perfectly coiffed hair made him seem more like a movie villain than a golfer. He exuded the kind of arrogance that only came with old money. Maria forced a smile, unsure of how to respond. "They're quite impressive," she said softly, gesturing to the clubs. "The detailing is beautiful." "Ah, yes, they certainly are. Probably more valuable than your monthly salary," he said, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. His tone wasn't playful, it was biting. "But then again, what would you know about quality equipment?" Maria's cheeks burned, but she bit back the retort rising to her lips. She hadn't meant to offend anyone, she'd just made a passing comment. Still, his gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, as if her very presence was an intrusion. "Try not to smudge anything while you're at it," he added, his voice dripping with condescension, before strolling away without waiting for a reply. For a moment, Maria stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the cart she'd been organizing. She had dealt with rude customers before, but something about this man's dismissive tone left her feeling smaller than usual. She shook her head and reminded herself why she was here. She couldn't afford to let one spoiled club member get to her. Gathering her composure, she continued her work, careful not to linger too long near the clubs again. The rest of her first day passed in a blur of cleaning, fetching, and dodging glances from members who barely seemed to notice her. By the time her shift ended, her feet ached, and her pride felt slightly bruised. Still, she reminded herself that it was just a job, nothing more, nothing less. As she left the pristine gates of Greenridge, the cool evening air brought a hint of relief. She would return tomorrow, prepared to stay in her lane and avoid any further confrontations. But as she walked back to her modest apartment, she couldn't help but replay the interaction in her mind. That man, what was his name? She hadn't caught it, but his face and tone were burned into her memory. The arrogance, the way he dismissed her without a second thought, it grated on her in a way she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just what he'd said, it was the way he'd looked at her, as though she were less than nothing. Maria sighed and squared her shoulders. Tomorrow was a new day, and she'd do her best to keep her head down and avoid him. After all, this job was too important to risk over a bruised ego. Still, a small part of her wished she'd had the courage to say something, anything, that would have wiped that smirk off his face. But courage, she reminded herself, was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. For now, survival was enough. Maria arrived at the club early the next morning, her resolve firm but her stomach knotted with unease. She moved quickly, slipping through the staff entrance and into the break room to grab her cleaning supplies. The memory of the previous day's encounter still lingered, a bitter reminder of how easily she could be singled out in this pristine world of wealth and entitlement. But she couldn't dwell on it. She had work to do, and keeping her job was her only priority. The next few days followed a routine she tried hard to make uneventful. Maria worked quietly, methodically, and made a point to avoid eye contact with the members. She navigated the halls and locker rooms with the precision of someone desperate to stay unnoticed. Her efforts, however, did not go entirely as planned. Mr. Prescott seemed to have a radar for her presence. Every time she passed by, his sharp tone would cut through the air, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. One morning, as Maria polished the glass trophy case in the lounge, his voice interrupted her focus. Well, if it isn't our resident golf expert," he drawled. A small group of members chuckled, their attention drawn to his every word. "Careful with those trophies, they might be worth more than your entire wardrobe." Maria's jaw tightened, but she kept her head down, focusing on the glass as though it held the secrets to the universe. She didn't dare look at him, though she could feel the heat of his gaze. Another time, she was replenishing towels in the women's locker room when she heard him call out from the corridor, his voice tinged with mockery. "Don't forget to dust the golf clubs. You might learn a thing or two about quality equipment." The laughter that followed stung more than his words. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the reminder of how powerless she was to defend herself. The staff had a clear rule: avoid conflict with members at all costs. Maria swallowed her pride, smiled faintly, and continued her work. But every comment, every smirk, chipped away at her resolve. On Thursday, while she cleaned the main dining area before the lunch rush, Mr. Prescott and his entourage strolled in, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. She kept her head down, hoping they wouldn't notice her, but his voice cut through the hum of conversation like a knife. "Careful there, Maria," he said, his tone syrupy sweet but laced with cruelty. "Wouldn't want to break anything valuable. These tables are probably older than your entire career." She felt the color rise in her cheeks but forced herself to keep polishing the silverware. The other members chuckled, a few exchanging amused glances. Maria gritted her teeth and silently repeated the mantra that had kept her going all week: "You need this job. You can't afford to make a scene." Still, the encounters left her drained. By the end of each day, her shoulders ached from tension, and her thoughts swirled with the things she wished she could say. At night, in the quiet of her small apartment, she replayed the moments in her head, imagining different outcomes, ones where she stood tall, met his gaze, and said something that silenced him once and for all. But in reality, she knew better. Confrontation wasn't an option. The other staff members noticed, of course. A few offered kind smiles or words of encouragement, but most simply avoided the subject. Mr. Prescott's reputation as the club's untouchable elite preceded him, and no one wanted to risk his wrath. Maria didn't blame them. She, too, had learned to tread carefully around him. By Friday, Maria's patience was wearing thin. As she wiped down the bar counter that afternoon, she overheard a pair of members discussing the upcoming charity tournament. Their excitement was palpable, their voices animated as they speculated about the contenders and the festivities planned for the weekend. Maria couldn't help but feel a pang of longing as she listened. Golf had once been her world, a part of her life she had locked away long ago. Now, even hearing about the tournament felt like a distant echo of something she could never reclaim. Lost in thought, she didn't notice Mr. Prescott approaching until he was standing directly behind her. "Dreaming of the tournament, Maria," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'd invite you to watch, but I'm not sure the spectators section is in your cleaning route." The group he was with erupted into laughter, and Maria's face flushed. She straightened up and busied herself with her rag, determined not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, her frustration simmered. She wanted to tell him off, to remind him that she wasn't some plaything for his amusement. Yet she remained silent, her expression carefully neutral. As the day wound down, Maria allowed herself a moment of solace in the quiet utility room. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edges as she tried to steady her breathing. She couldn't keep letting him get to her, not when she had come so far to rebuild her life. But as much as she tried to convince herself, the sting of his words lingered. For the first time, Maria found herself questioning if this job was worth it. But then she thought of her rent, the bills piling up, and the uncertainty of finding another opportunity in a new town. With a deep breath, she pushed herself off the counter and resolved to make it through another day. After all, she reminded herself, the tournament would be over soon, and with any luck, Mr. Prescott's attention would shift elsewhere. The Greenridge Golf Club buzzed with life, the annual charity tournament transforming the sprawling grounds into a lively festival of activity. Bright banners fluttered in the breeze, and the scent of freshly trimmed grass mingled with the rich aroma of catered delicacies. Maria moved among the throngs of elegantly dressed patrons, her head down as she worked. Her task was simple: keep the event running smoothly, out of sight and out of mind. She'd been dreading this day all week but had reassured herself that if she stuck to the plan, stay invisible, it would pass without incident. The members had gathered near the main pavilion, where a makeshift stage had been set up for the tournament's opening ceremony. Maria stayed at the edges, stacking chairs and tidying the area while trying to remain unnoticed. The sound of a microphone crackling to life silenced the crowd, and Maria glanced up to see the club's president, Mr. Whitaker, standing at the podium, his cheerful voice booming over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 25th Annual Greenridge Charity Golf Tournament," he declared, earning a round of applause. "Today, we celebrate not just our love for the game but our commitment to supporting local causes. Now, before we begin, let's introduce this year's contestants." The crowd's attention turned to the large screen behind Mr. Whitaker, where names and photos began to appear one by one. Maria watched from the sidelines, paying little attention. The list was filled with the usual suspects, club members with deep pockets and impressive handicaps. She was moving to the next set of chairs when her own name stopped her in her tracks. "Maria Torres," the announcer said. The world seemed to tilt. Maria froze, her heart pounding as she heard her name echo through the crowd. Whispers erupted around her, and she felt dozens of eyes turn in her direction. Her breath caught in her throat, and she looked up just in time to see her name emblazoned on the screen, accompanied by a blank photo frame. Her hands instinctively gripped the back of the chair she'd been adjusting, steadying herself as confusion and dread surged through her. Maria Torres. The voice was unmistakable, dripping with theatrical flair and unmistakable smugness. Mr. Prescott strode onto the stage, his tailored suit and easy confidence commanding attention. He gestured toward Maria with a sweeping motion, grinning like a man who'd just pulled off a masterful trick. "Now, don't be shy," he said, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs. "Maria here has shown such an enthusiastic interest in golf since joining us at Greenridge. I thought it only fair to give her the opportunity to showcase her talents today." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Maria felt none of its warmth. She stood rooted to the spot, her face hot with humiliation as she processed what was happening. Prescott's words weren't praise, they were a trap, a cruel joke designed to strip her of her dignity. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched helplessly as Mr. Prescott continued his performance, soaking in the attention. "Of course," he added with a chuckle, "I understand Maria might not have her own equipment. Don't worry, Maria, I'll personally provide everything you need to play. Unless, of course, you brought your own clubs?" The crowd laughed again, louder this time, and Maria felt her knees weaken. She wanted to disappear, to shrink into the earth and escape the sea of judgmental eyes. Her gaze darted to her boss, Mr. Riley, who had been standing near the pavilion. He hurried over, his face a mixture of concern and frustration. "I don't want to do this," Maria whispered urgently as he approached. "Please, don't make me." Riley sighed, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Maria, I understand how you feel, but this is Prescott we're talking about. He's a member, and a powerful one at that. If you don't go along with this, it'll only make things worse. But she stopped herself, knowing he was right. Refusing would cause a scene, and a scene would put her job in jeopardy. She couldn't afford that, no matter how humiliating this was. Riley placed a hand on her shoulder. Just get through today, he said softly. Do your best. You're stronger than this. The words offered little comfort, but Maria nodded reluctantly. She took a shaky breath and walked toward the stage, each step feeling heavier than the last. The crowd parted as she approached, their whispers prickling at her skin. When she reached the platform, she forced a polite smile, though her hands trembled as she clasped them in front of her. Ladies and gentlemen, Prescott said, addressing the crowd with the ease of someone who had never known insecurity. Let's all give Maria a warm welcome to her very first Greenridge tournament. The applause was polite, but Maria could feel the undercurrent of amusement. She glanced at Prescott, whose grin widened as he handed her a set of clubs, his clubs, gleaming and pristine. These should do nicely, he said, his tone low enough for only her to hear. Try not to scratch them. Maria clenched her jaw, swallowing the retort that burned on her tongue. She took the clubs and stepped down from the stage, her chest tight as she tried to hold back the tears threatening to spill. The crowd began to disperse, returning to their conversations and preparations for the tournament. Maria retreated to the locker room, desperate for a moment to collect herself. Inside, she placed the clubs against the wall and leaned on the counter, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and despair. She felt trapped, a pawn in someone else's cruel game. But as she stood there, her boss's words echoed in her mind, "You're stronger than this." Maria took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. She didn't know how she was going to survive this day, but one thing was clear, she had no choice but to try. Maria stood in the dimly lit locker room, staring at the plain polo shirt and khaki pants someone had handed her. They weren't hers, they barely fit, but at least they were clean. The white visor, too wide for her head, completed the look, though she felt more like an imposter than ever. Her heart raced as the distant hum of the crowd outside filtered through the walls. The muffled sound of laughter and conversation was a cruel reminder that she was about to become the centerpiece of a spectacle she never asked for. She adjusted the visor nervously, her hands shaking as she tried to steady her breathing. Every instinct told her to walk out the back door and never return, but the image of Mr. Riley's pleading expression flashed through her mind. Quitting wasn't an option. She needed this job, no matter how unbearable the circumstances. With a final deep breath, she picked up the gleaming set of clubs Mr. Prescott had so smugly lent her and walked toward the door. The sunlight was blinding as Maria stepped onto the pristine green of the course. The buzz of activity hushed slightly as heads turned to watch her. She could feel their eyes trailing her every move, their curiosity tinged with disbelief. Her pulse quickened as she made her way to the first tee, each step feeling like 100. The borrowed clothes felt stiff, and the grip of the club in her hand was foreign, yet somehow familiar. Mr. Prescott was already waiting, his self-assured smirk firmly in place as he adjusted his glove. "Ah, there she is," he called out, his voice dripping with mock warmth. "Ready to show us what all that enthusiasm was about?" The crowd chuckled, and Maria felt her cheeks burn. She forced herself to keep her gaze forward, focusing on the neatly trimmed grass beneath her feet. As she reached the tee box, she adjusted her stance and tried to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The crowd was still murmuring, some whispering in amusement, others in doubt. "Let's see what you've got," Prescott said, stepping back with an exaggerated flourish. Maria exhaled slowly, gripping the club tightly as she positioned herself over the ball. Her palms were clammy, her nerves threatening to overtake her, but something about the feel of the club in her hands, its weight, its balance, stirred a long-dormant part of her memory. She adjusted her stance, took a deep breath, and swung. The sharp, clean sound of the ball meeting the club reverberated through the air. Maria barely registered the gasps and murmurs around her as she watched the ball soar high and straight, landing neatly on the fairway. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a low murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. "Beginner's luck," Prescott said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He stepped up to take his shot, his form practiced and deliberate. His ball landed not far from Maria's, and he turned to her with a raised eyebrow, as if daring her to keep up. The game continued, hole by hole, and with each swing, Maria felt a piece of herself returning. Her movements, hesitant at first, grew more fluid, more natural. Muscle memory seemed to guide her, her body remembering techniques she hadn't practiced in years. It was as though she had slipped into a rhythm she thought she'd lost forever. On the third hole, she sank a long putt with effortless precision, earning a smattering of applause from the spectators. Maria glanced up, surprised by the sound, but quickly looked away, embarrassed by the attention. Her heart was pounding, but it wasn't just from nerves anymore. For the first time in years, she felt the spark of something she thought she'd buried, a love for the game. By the fifth hole, whispers of disbelief had turned into murmurs of admiration. Members who had laughed at her earlier were now watching closely, their expressions shifting from amusement to genuine interest. Maria remained focused, determined to block out the noise and concentrate on her game. With every successful shot, a small flicker of pride began to take root, though she wasn't sure if it belonged to her or the girl she used to be. At the eighth hole, Prescott's frustration began to show. He missed an easy putt, and the tightness in his jaw betrayed his growing irritation. Maria, on the other hand, sank her putt with the same steady confidence that had begun to carry her through the course. A few spectators clapped, and she caught snippets of their comments. Where did she learn to play like that? Is she even a beginner? She's better than half the members here. Maria tried to block out the chatter, though part of her couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Prescott, however, was not as composed. He muttered under his breath as he moved to the next hole, his usual arrogance dimmed by the growing attention Maria was receiving. By the time they reached the back nine, Maria's nerves had begun to settle. Her focus sharpened, and the game became something else entirely, a connection to her past. Every swing, every putt, brought flashes of memories long buried. She could see her father's encouraging smile, hear her mother's voice calling out advice from the sidelines. The grief she had carried for years felt lighter, if only for a moment. On the 11th hole, she hit a drive so clean and powerful that the crowd erupted in cheers. Maria stepped back, her hands trembling as she gripped the club. She glanced at the faces in the crowd, their expressions filled with something she hadn't seen directed at her in a long time, respect. It was overwhelming, and she felt tears prick her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. As they approached the 12th hole, Prescott leaned toward her, his voice low and clipped. "Don't get too comfortable," he said. "This is still my course." Maria closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a rush of memories surged forward, catching her off guard. She was 15 again, standing on a sun-dappled green with a golf club too big for her slender frame. Her father knelt beside her, adjusting her grip with gentle hands, his voice calm and patient. "Not too tight, sweetheart. Let the club do the work." His smile was warm, a blend of pride and encouragement, the kind that made her believe she could do anything. Her mother stood nearby, holding a bottle of water and a small notebook where she kept track of Maria's scores. "You've got this, Mija," her mother called out, her tone full of unwavering confidence. "Just picture the ball soaring straight and true." Maria could see their faces so clearly, their laughter blending with the rustle of trees and the distant chirping of birds. They had been her greatest supporters, her fiercest advocates. Every weekend, they would pack up the family car and drive to tournaments, always ready with sandwiches and words of encouragement. Her father was the strategist, offering advice on technique and strategy. Her mother was the cheerleader, her voice the loudest in the crowd no matter where Maria placed. The memories shifted, pulling her to the moment she won her first major junior championship. She stood on the podium, clutching a gold trophy almost as tall as she was, her cheeks flushed with pride. Her parents had been in the front row, their applause thunderous, their joy radiating like sunlight. Her father's arm had been slung around her shoulders as they posed for a photo, her mother holding up the trophy like it was the key to the world. The happiness was palpable, and for a moment, Maria smiled. But then, like a dark cloud creeping over a bright sky, the memories turned heavier, sharper. The tournament in question had been her last. It was a chilly Sunday evening, and they were driving home after a long but exhilarating day. Maria sat in the back seat, the trophy resting beside her, its polished surface glinting in the faint light of passing street lamps. Her parents were chatting up front, their voices filled with warmth and plans for the next tournament. The sound of the crash was deafening. Metal screeched against metal, glass shattered, and the world spun in a violent blur. Maria's head hit something hard, and for a moment, everything went black. When she woke up, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and burning rubber. Her vision blurred as she tried to make sense of the chaos around her. Voices shouted in the distance, and red and blue lights flashed against the dark sky. She tried to call out for her parents, but her voice came out weak, a fragile whisper swallowed by the sirens. The hospital room was sterile and cold, its stark whiteness doing little to soften the weight of the news. A nurse with kind eyes sat beside her, gently explaining what had happened. Her parents hadn't survived the crash. The words felt surreal, like a language she couldn't understand. Maria remembered staring at the ceiling, her mind refusing to process the loss. The trophy, now scuffed and scratched, sat on the bedside table, a cruel reminder of a day that had begun in triumph and ended in unimaginable tragedy. She wanted to scream, to cry, to make sense of it all, but instead, she felt nothing. Just a hollow, aching void. After the funeral, the world moved on, but Maria couldn't. The sight of a golf club, the smell of freshly cut grass, even the sound of applause, all of it became unbearable. She packed away her trophies, her medals, her gear, and shoved them into the darkest corner of a storage unit. Every memory of the game she once loved became a painful reminder of what she had lost. She was sent to live with an aunt in a different town, a woman who meant well but didn't understand the depth of Maria's grief. School became a blur, and golf a subject no one dared mention. Slowly, Maria faded into the background, a shadow of the vibrant, determined girl she had once been. The years passed, and though the sharp edges of her pain dulled, they never disappeared. She avoided golf courses, tournaments, even televised matches. The game that had once been her joy was now a wound she couldn't bear to reopen. Maria opened her eyes, the weight of the memories pressing heavily on her chest. Her hands trembled as she touched the borrowed club beside her, the sensation stirring both longing and fear. She hadn't thought about those days in years, and now they were rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. Maria stood on the 12th hole, the club gripped firmly in her hands, the sun casting its golden light across the course. The tension in the air was palpable as a crowd of onlookers gathered closer, their chatter subdued but filled with anticipation. She could feel the weight of their eyes, the whispers swirling around her like leaves in the wind. Yet, despite the noise, her focus sharpened. Her muscles hummed with the memory of every swing she had ever taken, every lesson her father had given her, every competition she had faced. The ball rested on the tee, a small, unassuming thing that now felt like the center of the universe. Maria squared her shoulders, adjusted her stance, and swung. The contact was clean, a satisfying crack that sent the ball soaring through the air. It arced gracefully against the sky before landing neatly on the green, mere feet from the hole. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by scattered applause. "Lucky shot," Mr. Prescott said, loud enough for everyone to hear, though the tightness in his voice betrayed his frustration. Maria didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the crowd was beginning to root for her. The whispers of beginner's luck were fading, replaced by genuine admiration. She walked calmly toward her ball, her heart steadying with every step. As the game progressed, her confidence grew. Each shot felt like a small triumph, a piece of herself falling back into place. On the 14th hole, she nailed a long putt that had even the caddies clapping. On the 16th, she avoided a tricky sand trap with a finesse that left the other players shaking their heads in disbelief. The applause grew louder, more frequent, as spectators began to drift from other parts of the course to watch her play. Maria tried not to let it distract her, though a part of her couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Mr. Prescott, however, was a different story. His demeanor grew more irritable with every hole. He muttered to himself after each of Maria's successful shots, his smirk replaced by a clenched jaw and furrowed brow. By the 17th hole, his frustration was on full display when he sliced his drive into the rough, prompting a stifled laugh from one of the younger members in the crowd. Maria caught the momentary flush of red on his face and felt a pang of satisfaction, though she quickly pushed it aside. On the final hole, the pressure was at its peak. The leaderboard displayed Maria's surprising rise through the ranks. She was tied for third place, a position no one had expected her to achieve. The crowd around the 18th green was larger now, buzzing with excitement as they waited to see if the quiet housekeeper with no reputation could actually place in the tournament. Maria stepped onto the tee box, her nerves threatening to creep in as she glanced at the crowd. She spotted Mr. Riley near the back, giving her a small, encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. She couldn't control the crowd, the whispers, or Mr. Prescott's glares, but she could control this moment. Her swing was smooth and deliberate, the ball cutting through the air with precision. It landed on the fairway, perfectly positioned for an approach to the green. As she walked toward it, her steps felt lighter, more assured. The years of doubt and grief seemed to melt away with every stride, replaced by a quiet determination. Her second shot was just as steady, placing the ball within striking distance of the hole. The crowd erupted into cheers, their enthusiasm a mix of surprise and genuine admiration. Maria felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips but quickly refocused. She couldn't let the moment get to her, not yet. When it was her turn to putt, the green fell silent. She crouched, studying the slope and the distance, her mind calculating the angles as naturally as breathing. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, calm and steady. "Follow through, sweetheart. Trust yourself." Maria stood, gripped her putter, and took the shot. The ball rolled smoothly along the green, its path unwavering until it dropped into the hole with a satisfying plunk. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, the sound washing over her like a wave. "Third place," someone shouted, and Maria blinked, momentarily stunned. She had done it. She had actually placed in the tournament. The announcer confirmed it moments later, his voice booming across the course. "Maria Torres takes third place in the Greenridge Charity Tournament." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the applause, her gaze scanning the crowd. She saw faces filled with genuine admiration, some even offering smiles and nods of approval. For a moment, she let herself bask in the accomplishment, the warmth of the crowd filling a space she hadn't realized was so empty. Mr. Prescott, however, was less than pleased. He stood to the side, his expression dark as his friends teased him mercilessly. "Didn't see that coming, Prescott," one of them said, clapping him on the back. "Looks like your little joke backfired." Another chimed in, laughing. "Better watch out, she might take first place next year." Prescott's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing as he watched Maria. She felt his gaze but didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin, meeting his stare with quiet strength. Whatever power he thought he had over her was gone now. She had proven herself, not just to him, but to everyone, and most importantly, to herself. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria stood by the green, the applause still ringing in her ears. Mr. Riley approached, his expression one of quiet pride. You were incredible out there, he said softly. I hope you know that. Maria smiled, her chest swelling with gratitude. Thank you, she replied. Her voice was steady, though her heart felt full. As she walked back toward the clubhouse, the borrowed clubs slung over her shoulder, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. She had come to the tournament expecting humiliation, but she had found something else entirely, her own strength, her own skill, and a glimmer of the girl she used to be. The clubhouse buzzed with energy as the tournament wrapped up, members and spectators mingling in the glow of a successful event. Maria stood near the edge of the room, quietly sipping water and trying to stay out of the way as congratulations and chatter swirled around her. She felt a mix of relief and pride, her nerves finally beginning to settle after the day's whirlwind. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of having accomplished something she thought was lost to her. Across the room, Mr. Prescott's friends had gathered in a small circle, their laughter carrying over the hum of conversation. He stood in the middle, his face tight as his companions teased him mercilessly. Third place, one of them said, slapping him on the back with mock enthusiasm. And she's not even a member. Looks like you underestimated her. Another chimed in, smirking. What's the matter, Prescott? Thought this would be an easy win for you? Prescott's jaw tightened, the forced smile on his face barely holding. She got lucky, he said sharply. One good day doesn't make her a golfer. Oh, come on, one of his friends said, grinning. Give her some credit. She played better than half the people here, including you. The laughter that followed was light-hearted, but Prescott's patience was wearing thin. He could feel the eyes of the room shifting toward him, the quiet judgment of those who had seen him put Maria in this position. The plan to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly, and now he was the one being laughed at. His pride, so carefully guarded, was in tatters. Spotting Maria near the corner of the room, he felt a surge of anger bubble to the surface. With quick, deliberate steps, he made his way toward her, ignoring the curious glances that followed his movement. Maria, unaware of his approach, turned as he stopped just a few feet away. Enjoying yourself? He asked, his voice low but sharp. Maria blinked, caught off guard by his tone. I'm sorry, she said, her confusion evident. I said, Prescott repeated, stepping closer, are you enjoying the attention? Must be nice, getting a free ride on beginner's luck. Maria's expression hardened slightly, though she kept her voice calm. I just played the game. That's all. The game? Prescott scoffed, his voice rising just enough to draw a few glances. You don't belong here. Don't think for a second that today changes that. Maria took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening around her water glass. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut through the tension. Mr. Prescott, said Mr. Riley, his tone firm as he stepped between them. I think that's enough. Prescott turned, his frustration barely masked. Stay out of this, Riley. This is between me and... No, it's not, Riley interrupted, his gaze steady. Maria played with skill, grace, and dignity today, more than I can say for some people. If you're upset, maybe take a look at yourself instead of taking it out on her. The room had grown noticeably quieter, the conversations around them fading as people began to watch the confrontation unfold. Prescott's cheeks flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, his composure slipping as he realized the attention was now fully on him. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said through gritted teeth, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Riley didn't back down. I think I do, he said evenly. You tried to humiliate her, and instead, she showed everyone here what real talent and perseverance look like. If you can't handle that, that's your problem, not hers. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Prescott's eyes darted around the room. The expressions he saw were not the supportive smiles he was used to but something far less comfortable, disapproval, amusement, even pity. His carefully constructed image was crumbling, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Maria stood silently, her chest tight as she watched the scene unfold. She hadn't asked for any of this, for the confrontation, the humiliation, or even the praise. Yet, as she looked at Riley, standing firmly in her defense, a small part of her felt something she hadn't in a long time: protected. Prescott straightened, his jaw set as he glanced between Riley and Maria. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fail him. The weight of the room's attention was too much, and with a sharp exhale, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit. The murmur of voices followed him, a mixture of whispers and laughter that only deepened his retreat. As the door swung shut behind him, the tension in the room eased, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. Riley turned to Maria, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked. Maria nodded slowly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Yes. Thank you." "You didn't deserve that," Riley said firmly. "You've earned every bit of respect you're getting today." Maria gave him a small, grateful smile, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she looked around the room. The faces that met her gaze weren't mocking or dismissive, they were warm, even admiring. For the first time since stepping onto the course, she felt like she truly belonged, if only for a moment. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria allowed herself to breathe deeply. The confrontation had left her shaken, but it had also shown her something unexpected: she wasn't as alone as she thought. There were people who saw her, who valued her, not just for her skill but for who she was. And that realization, more than anything, gave her the strength to stand a little taller as the evening wore on. The Prescott estate, a sprawling testament to old money and prestige, sat bathed in the soft light of evening. Inside, in a richly paneled study lined with shelves of leather-bound books, Edward Prescott poured himself a glass of whiskey. His movements were measured, deliberate, but his expression betrayed the frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. He placed the glass on his desk and leaned back in his chair, waiting. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and moments later, the door opened. Edward looked up to see his son, Daniel, stepping inside. Daniel's posture was confident as always, but Edward could see the faint tension in his shoulders, the lingering flush of embarrassment on his face. "You wanted to see me?" Daniel said, his tone carefully neutral. Edward gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit." Daniel hesitated but complied, his movements less self-assured than usual. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his legs casually, though his father's piercing gaze made it clear this was not a casual meeting. "I heard about today," Edward began, his voice calm but firm. "Quite the scene, from what I've been told." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked away, his eyes tracing the pattern of the Persian rug beneath his feet. "It's been blown out of proportion," he said finally. "People love to talk." Edward leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "From what I understand, you went out of your way to humiliate a member of the staff. Is that accurate?" Daniel bristled at the word. "She's not just staff," he said defensively. "She was trying to." "To what?" Edward interrupted, his tone sharper now. "Do her job? Play in a tournament you forced her into? And then, from what I hear, she outperformed nearly everyone, including you." Daniel's cheeks flushed, and he looked away again, the words hitting harder than he wanted to admit. "She got lucky," he muttered. "It's not as if she belongs there." Edward's eyes narrowed, his usually calm demeanor hardening. "Daniel, do you hear yourself? You sound like a petulant child who didn't get his way." "I was just," Daniel began, but Edward held up a hand to stop him. "You were just what?" "Embarrassed? Upset that someone you deemed unworthy had the audacity to be better than you?" Edward's voice was steady but carried a weight that left no room for argument. "This club, this family name, was built on respect and fairness. I will not have you tarnish either because of your own insecurities." Daniel's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms defensively. "She shouldn't even have been playing," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. Edward shook his head, his disappointment evident. "She played because you put her in that position. And instead of admitting you were wrong, you doubled down, trying to belittle her at every turn. Do you know how that reflects on you? On us?" Daniel's silence was answer enough. Edward stood, walking to the large window that overlooked the perfectly manicured gardens. He took a sip of his whiskey before turning back to face his son. "You've spent your life surrounded by privilege, Daniel. Everything has been handed to you, and yet you act as though the world owes you more. It's time you learn that respect is not given because of wealth or status. It's earned." The words landed heavily, and for the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of shame. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of his father's disappointment pressing down on him. "You've jeopardized your standing at the club," Edward continued. "And worse, you've made it clear to everyone there that you lack the character I've always tried to instill in you. That ends now." Daniel looked up, the defiance in his eyes giving way to something more vulnerable. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. Edward's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "Make it right. Apologize to her. Publicly. And mean it." Daniel's stomach churned at the thought, but he nodded slowly. He couldn't argue with his father, not when the truth of his words was so painfully clear. "And Daniel," Edward added, his voice softer now, "remember that humility is not a weakness. It's a strength. Learn from this, or you'll find yourself alone in a world that no amount of money can shield you from." As Edward returned to his desk, Daniel sat in silence, the gravity of the conversation settling over him. He had spent his life chasing admiration, validation, but in doing so, he had ignored the values that truly mattered. He had never considered how his actions might affect others, until now. When Daniel finally left the study, the weight of his father's words lingered. He walked through the quiet halls of the estate, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The image of Maria's calm determination on the course flashed in his mind, followed by the looks of disapproval from the crowd as he had stormed off. For the first time, he truly saw himself as they must have seen him, arrogant, petty, and small. The shame was a bitter pill to swallow, but it brought with it a glimmer of clarity. He had been wrong, about Maria, about the game, about himself. And if he wanted to move forward, he needed to face that truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Greenridge Golf Club, casting a soft golden glow on the dew-kissed grass. Maria arrived early, the crisp morning air offering a welcome calm after the whirlwind of the previous day. She still couldn't quite process everything that had happened. Third place. The applause. The way people had looked at her, not with pity or disdain, but with genuine respect. She clung to those moments, afraid they might fade like a fleeting dream. As she made her way to the staff room, she was startled to see Mr. Prescott standing near the clubhouse entrance. He was alone, his usual polished demeanor replaced by something more subdued. For a moment, Maria considered walking the long way around to avoid him, but before she could decide, he caught sight of her. "Maria," he called out, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. There was no trace of mockery, no smug undertone. Instead, he sounded hesitant, almost uncertain. She stopped, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "Mr. Prescott," she replied cautiously. He stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, his posture unusually humble. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "For everything." Maria blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. This was the last thing she expected. "I was out of line," he continued. "More than that, I was cruel. I used my position here to humiliate you, and it was wrong. You didn't deserve that. You've shown more strength and grace than I could ever hope to, and I'm truly sorry." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. Maria studied his face, searching for any hint of sarcasm or insincerity, but found none. The crowd from the day before would have been stunned to see him like this, contrite, vulnerable, human. "I appreciate that," she said finally, her voice even. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Mr. Prescott nodded, relief flickering across his features. "You're a remarkable player," he added. "And, if I'm being honest, watching you yesterday reminded me why I fell in love with the game in the first place." Before Maria could respond, the club president, Mr. Whitaker, appeared at the top of the clubhouse steps. He greeted them both with a warm smile, though his attention was clearly on Maria. "Maria," he said, motioning for her to join him. "Could I have a word?" Maria glanced at Mr. Prescott, who gave her a small nod, then followed Mr. Whitaker up the steps. Inside the office, the president gestured for her to sit, his expression thoughtful but kind. "I want to start by congratulating you," he said. "Your performance yesterday was nothing short of extraordinary. But more than that, the way you carried yourself, under pressure, in the face of adversity, it was inspiring." Maria felt her cheeks warm at the praise but managed a polite smile. "Thank you," she said softly. Mr. Whitaker leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "We've been looking to revamp our junior golf program," he said. "We want someone who not only knows the game but can inspire the next generation. Someone with heart, resilience, and passion. Watching you yesterday, it became clear to me that you're exactly who we need." Maria's breath caught in her throat. "Are you offering me a position?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Yes," he said, his smile widening. "Golf tutor for the junior members. You'd be working directly with them, helping to develop their skills and their love for the game." Maria's mind raced. The thought of stepping back into the world of golf, not as a competitor but as a mentor, was both terrifying and exhilarating. For years, she'd buried her connection to the sport, convinced it was too painful to revisit. Yet here was an opportunity to not only embrace it again but to share it with others. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Say yes," Mr. Whitaker said with a grin. "We'd be lucky to have you." Maria hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes," she said, a tentative smile breaking across her face. "I'd love to." As she left the office, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The weight she'd carried, the grief, the doubt, the fear, seemed to lift with every step. She made her way back outside, where Mr. Prescott was still waiting. "Well?" he asked, his curiosity evident. Maria looked at him, her smile growing. "I'm going to be the new golf tutor," she said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. For a moment, Mr. Prescott looked genuinely happy for her. "You'll be great," he said simply. They walked together toward the course, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. As they reached the edge of the green, Maria turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you know why I stopped playing?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Mr. Prescott shook his head. "I assumed it was a choice." "It wasn't," Maria said, her gaze distant. "My parents died in a car accident after a tournament. I was just a kid, and golf was everything to me. But after they were gone, I couldn't face it. It hurt too much." He didn't interrupt, letting her continue. "For years, I thought I'd lost that part of myself," she said. "But yesterday reminded me that it's still there. That maybe I can love the game again, without losing myself to it." Mr. Prescott looked at her with something close to admiration. "That kind of strength," he said, "is what makes you extraordinary." Maria met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw no arrogance, no pretense, just sincerity. She smiled softly. "Thank you," she said. As the morning unfolded, the clubhouse grew livelier, but Maria felt a quiet sense of peace. She had rediscovered something she thought she'd lost forever, and with it came a new sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. The course stretched out before her, not as a reminder of the past but as a promise of what could be.